The mechanics at Port Moresby called it the sick bird, and John Smith was tired of defending it. His P-40 Warhawk sat on the tarmac with its engine cowling open, exposing the Allison V1710 engine that refused to run properly at full power. Every time Smith pushed the throttle past 75%, the cylinder head temperature spiked into the red, the engine began knocking, and white smoke poured from the exhaust. The mechanics had rebuilt the engine twice, replaced the cooling system, adjusted the fuel mixture, and nothing fixed the problem. "Lieutenant Smith, this aircraft is not combat capable," the crew chief said for the third time that week. "You need to be assigned a different bird." "There are no different birds," John said. "Every P-40 in the squadron is either flying missions or being repaired. This is what I have." "Then you shouldn't be flying. That engine can't sustain combat power. You'll be slow, vulnerable, a liability to your squadron." John had heard variations of this argument for 2 months, ever since he'd been assigned the problematic P-40 in September 1943. He'd requested a replacement aircraft repeatedly. The requests were denied. The 5th Air Force in New Guinea was chronically short of everything, including functional fighters. Pilots flew what was available, and what was available for John was an aircraft with an engine that couldn't run at full power without overheating. John Smith was 24 years old, a member of the Kiowa tribe from Oklahoma. He'd grown up on a reservation where poverty was a given, where making do with broken equipment was a survival skill, where you either fixed what you had or you went without. His father had been a farmer working land that barely produced enough to feed the family. His mother had taken in sewing to supplement their income. John had learned early that complaining about inadequate tools was pointless. You worked with what you had. He'd enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1901 partly out of patriotism, partly because military service offered a salary and steady meals that the reservation couldn't provide. Flight training had been difficult. He was one of only 3 Native American cadets in his class, and the instructors had low expectations. "Indians don't have the temperament for flying," one instructor had said within John's hearing. "Too emotional, can't handle stress." John had proved them wrong by graduating 3rd in his class. He'd been assigned to P-40 Warhawks and shipped to New Guinea in July 1943 to fight the Japanese. The P-40 was outdated by 1943 standards, slower than Japanese Zeros, less maneuverable, outclassed in almost every performance metric. But it was tough, could absorb tremendous damage, and had heavy armament. American pilots learned to use hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks that exploited the P-40's superior dive speed. But those tactics required being able to reach high speeds quickly, which required full engine power. John's malfunctioning engine made that impossible. When his squadron dove on enemy formations, John lagged behind, his engine unable to produce maximum thrust. When they climbed to altitude, John was slower, always playing catch-up. The other pilots noticed. "Hey, Chief, you planning to join the fight, or just sightsee?" The nickname Chief had started as a slur, a reference to his Native American heritage, but John had claimed it, made it his. Better to own the nickname than let it be used against him. "Engine's running rough," John said after one mission where he'd been noticeably slower than the rest of the squadron. "Engine's always running rough. Maybe you're just a slow pilot." The nickname stuck. The slow pilot. It was said with a mix of mockery and concern. Slow pilots didn't survive long in air combat. The Japanese flew Zeros that were faster and more maneuverable than P-40s. If you couldn't keep up with your squadron, you became an isolated target. Several pilots suggested John should be grounded, reassigned to non-flying duties until he got a functional aircraft. John considered accepting the reassignment. Flying a crippled aircraft into combat was dangerous, not just for him, but for the pilots who might try to protect him. But being grounded meant admitting defeat, accepting that his malfunctioning equipment made him useless. And John had spent his entire life being told he was less capable than white men. He wasn't going to prove them right by giving up. Instead, he started studying his aircraft's limitations. He spent hours with the mechanics, learning exactly what was wrong with the engine. The problem was a combination of factors: inadequate cooling, a damaged cylinder that created uneven compression, and fuel mixture issues that caused pre-ignition at high power settings. The mechanics couldn't fix it without parts they didn't have and wouldn't receive for months. But John noticed something interesting in the engine's behavior. At low power settings, below 75% throttle, The engine ran smoothly. Temperature stayed in normal range, no knocking, no smoke. The aircraft was slower, but it was reliable, and fuel consumption was dramatically lower. At 75% power, the P-40 could stay airborne for nearly 4 hours instead of the usual 2 hours at full power. John started thinking about what that meant tactically. In most air combat, fights were brief, 2 to 5 minutes of maneuvering, firing, and disengaging. Fuel management wasn't critical because engagements ended before anyone ran low. But what if you could extend the fight? What if you could stay in the air longer than the enemy, let them burn through their fuel aggressively while you conserved yours? The idea seemed absurd. Air combat doctrine emphasized speed and aggression. You attacked with maximum power, hit hard, and disengaged before the enemy could respond. Flying slowly in combat was considered suicidal. You'd be an easy target, unable to evade, unable to escape. But John thought about hunting, about techniques his father had taught him. You didn't always chase prey directly. Sometimes you let prey exhaust itself, conserve your own energy, wait for the moment when your target was tired and vulnerable. Could the same principle apply to aerial combat? He started experimenting during routine patrol missions. He'd fly at 75% power, see how the aircraft handled, how much slower he was than other P-40s at full power. The speed difference was significant. He was doing about 280 miles per hour while the others were doing 340, but his fuel consumption was 40% lower. When other pilots landed with minimal fuel after 2-hour patrols, John had enough fuel for another hour of flying. The squadron commander noticed the fuel discrepancy during a post-flight debrief. "Smith, why are you landing with so much fuel remaining? Are you not patrolling your assigned sector?" "I'm patrolling, sir, just at lower power settings to manage my engine problem." "You're flying combat, missions at reduced power? That's dangerous. You're slow, vulnerable." "I'm fuel efficient, sir, and my engine runs reliably at lower settings." "Lieutenant, I'm going to be direct with you. Your aircraft is not combat capable. You're a liability. I'm recommending you be grounded until we can get you a functional P-40. "Sir, with respect, let me prove the technique works. One combat mission. If I can't perform effectively, I'll accept grounding." The commander considered this. The squadron was undermanned, needed every pilot, and John had completed his training, had the skills, just had inadequate equipment. "One mission, Smith, but if you get yourself killed because you're too slow to evade, that's on you." John's chance came on December 18, 1943, a bomber escort mission, protecting Australian Beaufighters attacking Japanese shipping near Rabaul. The squadron would fly top cover while the bombers made their runs. It was a straightforward mission, one where John's slower speed might not be catastrophic if he positioned himself correctly. They took off at 0800 hours, 16 P-40s climbing to 15,000 feet. John flew at 75% power, lagging behind the formation but maintaining visual contact. His fuel gauge showed he was burning fuel at exactly the rate he'd calculated. At this rate, he could stay airborne for 3.5 hours. The bombers made their runs without incident. No enemy fighters appeared. John maintained his position, flew his sector, proved he could keep up with the formation even at reduced power. When they landed, the squadron commander grudgingly acknowledged that John had performed adequately. "All right, Smith, you can keep flying for now, but the first time your slow speed puts other pilots at risk, you're done." John continued flying missions at 75% power. He scored his first kill in November 1943, a Zero that had damaged another P-40 and was pursuing it. John dove from above, his lower power setting making his dive slower but more controlled. He got a clean deflection shot and the Zero went down. One kill, and he'd done it while flying at reduced power. The other pilots were surprised but not impressed. Chief got lucky. That Zero must have been damaged or distracted. John scored his second kill 3 weeks later, again using his low-power technique. This time the squadron started paying attention. The slow pilot was getting kills despite his handicap. How? John explained his fuel management approach. "I can stay in the air longer. When enemy fighters are low on fuel, they have to break off combat. I don't. I can keep fighting when they have to leave. That's assuming they don't shoot you down first because you're too slow to evade." "I'm not too slow to evade. I'm just not wasting fuel on unnecessary speed. I position carefully, manage my energy, and I'm still fighting when they're heading home." The technique remained controversial, but John kept using it. By December 1943, he had 3 confirmed kills, all achieved while flying at 75% power. His aircraft was still the sick bird, still couldn't run at full throttle, still made him the slowest pilot in the squadron. On December 26, 1943, John would fly a mission that would prove his fuel management technique wasn't just a workaround for a broken engine. It was a legitimate tactical approach that could win fights against overwhelming odds. The mission briefing on December 26, 1943, was grim. Intelligence reported a large formation of Japanese bombers escorted by fighters heading toward Allied positions at Finschhafen. The squadron's job was to intercept, engage the escorts, and protect ground forces from the bombing attack. The intelligence officer estimated at least 20 enemy fighters, Zeros, and possibly some Ki-43 Oscars. John's squadron launched with 12 P-40s, all they could get airborne, 12 American fighters against an estimated 20 or more Japanese. The mathematics were poor, but the mission was critical. If the bombers got through, Allied positions would be devastated. They climbed to 18,000 feet and headed northwest toward the intercept point. John flew his usual position, lagging slightly behind the formation, his engine running smoothly at 75% power, while the others pushed their throttles to the firewall. His fuel gauge showed excellent consumption. At this rate, he had nearly 4 hours of flight time available. At 09:20 hours, they spotted the enemy formation. The intelligence estimate had been wrong. It wasn't 20 fighters. It was more like 40, a massive fighter sweep with no bombers. The Japanese had sent a pure fighter group, looking to clear the skies of American aircraft before sending in the vulnerable bombers. The squadron commander's voice came over the radio, tight with stress. "All aircraft, we are heavily outnumbered. Engage as able. Try to disrupt their formation. If you get in trouble, extend and run. Don't try to be heroes." The American P-40s dove into the Japanese formation. Within seconds, the sky was chaos, aircraft twisting and turning, tracers crisscrossing, radio chatter overlapping into incomprehensible noise. John dove with the squadron, but at his lower speed, he ended up separated from the main engagement, off to the side where several Zeros had broken away from the main group. He counted them, 11 Zeros forming up into a coordinated attack group. And they'd spotted him, the lone P-40 flying slower than the others, separated from his squadron. Easy prey. The Zeros split into 2 groups, 6 came at him from above, 5 positioned below and ahead to cut off his escape. Standard tactics for a coordinated kill. John was boxed in, outnumbered 11-1, flying an aircraft that couldn't run at full power. By every tactical measure, he was dead. But John had been thinking about this scenario for months. He'd been preparing for the moment when his slow aircraft and limited power would become advantages rather than liabilities. He checked his fuel gauge, nearly full. He checked the positions of the 11 Zeros. They were aggressive, positioning for quick kills, burning fuel at high power settings. John made a decision that violated every fighter pilot's instinct. He reduced power even further. He pulled his throttle back to 60%, slowing his P-40 to about 240 miles per hour. The Zeros attacking from above saw him slow and assumed he was damaged, losing power. They dove more aggressively, not wanting to lose an easy kill. John waited until they committed to their dives, then he executed a gentle climbing turn. Not a hard brake that would bleed all his speed, just a steady climb that used his remaining energy efficiently. The diving Zeros overshot, their high speed carrying them past his new position. They'd been expecting him to try to run or to turn toward. They hadn't expected him to just continue flying slowly. The 5 Zeros that had been positioned ahead saw their squadron mates overshoot and moved in to attack. But John had timed his maneuver to put some distance between himself and the first group. Now, only the 5 ahead were immediate threats. Still poor odds, but better than 11. The 5 Zeros approached in a loose line, planning to attack in sequence so that while John evaded one, another could get a firing solution. It was professional, coordinated, the kind of tactic that killed isolated American pilots regularly. But it assumed John would try to evade aggressively, would burn energy in hard turns, would eventually stall or become predictable. John didn't evade aggressively. When the first Zero attacked, John turned gently, just enough to make the Zero's deflection shot difficult. The Japanese pilot fired anyway, his rounds passing behind John's tail. The Zero flashed past, fast and committed, and had to climb to regain position. The second Zero attacked. John turned the other direction, again gently, again making the shot difficult without burning excessive energy. The Zero fired, missed, extended away. The third, fourth, fifth Zeros all attacked in sequence. John turned back, climbed slightly, descended slightly, never doing anything dramatic, never burning energy unnecessarily, just making himself difficult to hit while preserving his fuel and altitude. The Zeros were burning fuel aggressively at combat power, maneuvering hard, firing guns that added weight and drag. After 3 minutes of this, John glanced at his fuel gauge. He'd burned maybe 10% of his fuel. The Zeros, flying at combat power and maneuvering hard, had probably burned 30% or more, and they hadn't hit him once. The 6 Zeros that had overshot initially had climbed back to altitude and were rejoining the fight. Now all 11 were coordinating, trying different tactics. They attempted a hammer and anvil, some attacking from above while others attacked from below. John climbed away from the low threat, accepted some hits from the high threat that damaged his tail, but didn't impair flight, then descended and turned to break the coordination. They tried a pincer attack from the sides. John turned into one group, spoiling their angle, then reversed to spoil the other group's approach. They tried everything: coordinated dives, sequential attacks from different altitudes, attempts to box him into a corner of the sky where he'd have no escape. Nothing worked because John wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to survive long enough for the Zeros to run out of fuel. After 8 minutes of combat, one of the Zeros broke off and headed east. John watched him go. The aircraft was flying straight and level, not maneuvering, clearly heading home. Out of fuel or low enough that continuing the fight was too risky. 7 minutes later, 2 more Zeros departed, then another. The aggressive maneuvering, the high power settings, the multiple attack runs. It was consuming fuel faster than they'd anticipated, and John was still flying, still at 60% power, still had 7% of his fuel remaining. The remaining 7 Zeros became more cautious. They'd realized this American pilot wasn't a crippled, easy kill. He was doing something they didn't understand, flying slowly, apparently damaged, yet somehow surviving against overwhelming odds. They regrouped, reformed their line, and tried more methodical attacks. But John had been watching their formations, studying their patterns. He noticed that when they set up for an attack run, there was always a 3-second window where they were committed to their approach vector, flying predictably. If he could position himself correctly during that window, he could get a firing solution. When the next Zero began his attack run, John didn't turn away. He turned into the attack, reducing the Zero's deflection angle, making the geometry simpler. The Zero pilot, surprised by the head-on approach, fired early. His rounds passed wide. John held his course, waited for the Zero to fly closer, then fired a 2-second burst. Hits along the wing and engine cowling. The Zero rolled away, trailing smoke. 4 confirmed kills for John, plus this one made 5. But it wasn't a confirmed kill yet. He hadn't seen it crash. He added it to his mental tally as probably destroyed all, and returned his focus to the remaining 6 Zeros. They were more hesitant now, circling at a distance, coordinating on their radios. They'd been fighting this lone P-40 for 15 minutes and had lost at least 1 aircraft, possibly more to fuel exhaustion. The psychology of the situation was shifting. They'd gone from hunters to confused, frustrated predators, chasing prey that refused to behave correctly. 2 more Zeros departed, clearly out of fuel, clearly unable to continue the fight. That left 4. 4 against 1 were still poor odds, but John's fuel gauge showed he had 60% remaining. He could fight for another hour if necessary. The 4 remaining Zeros tried one more coordinated attack, a carefully timed assault from 4 different angles designed to make evasion impossible. John watched them position, calculated the timing, and made a choice that seemed insane. He reduced power even further, down to 50%, and began a gentle descending spiral. The Zeros, expecting him to try to climb or turn hard, found their attack geometry completely wrong. They'd aimed at where a normal pilot would be, not where John actually was. They overshot, scattered, and had to reposition. And repositioning meant more high-power maneuvering, which meant more fuel consumed. After 3 minutes of trying to reacquire John in his gentle spiral, 3 of the 4 remaining Zeros departed. They were clearly out of fuel, their pilots making the rational decision that survival meant breaking off combat immediately. That left 1 Zero. One Japanese pilot who had either managed his fuel better than his squadron mates or was simply too stubborn to leave. He approached cautiously, no longer aggressive, clearly low on fuel and trying to make one final attack count. John had been in combat for 22 minutes and was still at 15,000 feet with 55% fuel remaining. He had all the time in the world. He let the Zero approach, watched his attack vector, and when the Japanese pilot committed to his firing pass, John turned hard for the first time in the entire engagement. The sudden aggressive maneuver, the first hard turn John had made, caught the Zero pilot completely off guard. He'd been expecting the gentle evasions John had been using for 20 minutes. The hard turn put John inside the Zero's turn radius, put him behind the Japanese fighter, gave him a perfect tail chase position. John fired a long burst. The Zero's engine exploded, the aircraft nosed over, and the pilot bailed out. John watched the parachute open, watched the pilot drift down toward the jungle below. Confirmed kill number 4 for this engagement, number 7 total for John's combat career. He looked around the sky. Empty, all 11 Zeros were gone. Some destroyed, some damaged, most simply out of fuel and forced to return to base. John checked his instruments. Fuel at 52%, engine temperature normal, no critical damage despite some hits to his tail section. He'd survived an 11 against 1 fight by doing the one thing no other fighter pilot would have done. He'd flown slowly, conserved fuel, and waited for the enemy to exhaust themselves. He turned toward Port Moresby and climbed to 20,000 feet, where he could see his squadron reforming after their engagement with the main Japanese formation. He joined them, and his squadron commander immediately came on the radio. "Smith, where the hell have you been? We've been looking for you." "Engaged 11 Zeros, sir. Shot down at least 1, possibly more. The rest ran out of fuel and left." "You engaged 11 Zeros by yourself?" "Yes, sir, for about 23 minutes. "And you survived?" "Yes, sir. My aircraft is damaged but flyable." "How is that possible?" "Fuel management, sir. I flew at low power, conserved fuel, let them burn through theirs. When they had to leave, I was still fighting." The squadron landed at Port Moresby with varying levels of damage. 3 P-40s were write-offs, 2 damaged to repair. 5 more needed extensive maintenance. John's aircraft, despite the hits it had taken, was in relatively good condition. The mechanics examined the tail damage and shook their heads. "Lieutenant Smith, you took rounds through your tail section. These could have been catastrophic." "But they weren't," John said. "The aircraft held together." The gun camera footage was reviewed that evening. It confirmed one certain kill. The Zero John had shot down at the end of the engagement. The earlier damaged Zero was listed as probably destroyed, but the squadron intelligence officer noted something unusual. "Lieutenant Smith, your footage shows you in combat for 23 continuous minutes. That's the longest single engagement I've seen in this theater. Most dogfights last 3 to 5 minutes. How did you sustain combat for that long?" "I didn't burn fuel aggressively, sir. I managed my power settings, conserved energy, waited for the enemy to exhaust themselves." "By flying slowly." "By flying efficiently, sir. Bolum 3. The December 26th engagement changed how the 5th Air Force thought about fuel management in combat. Within a week, every fighter squadron in the theater had received a tactical bulletin describing John Smith's technique, extended combat through throttle discipline, using fuel conservation as a strategic weapon, letting enemy aggression become enemy vulnerability. Most pilots were skeptical. "Flying slow in combat is suicide," one squadron commander wrote in his response to the bulletin. Smith got lucky. If those Zeros had been more aggressive, if they'd pressed their attacks despite fuel concerns, he'd be dead. But a few pilots understood what John had proven. Air combat wasn't just about speed and maneuverability. It was also about endurance, about who could stay in the fight longest. Japanese fighters had limited fuel capacity, and the distances they flew to reach combat zones meant they arrived with minimal reserves. If American pilots could extend engagements, could force the Japanese to burn fuel defensively, the mathematics shifted. John flew 23 more combat missions over the next 4 months, always at reduced power, always managing his fuel carefully. He shot down 4 more confirmed enemy aircraft, bringing his total to 8 kills, making him an ace despite flying an aircraft that couldn't run at full power. His technique was studied, analyzed, and cautiously incorporated into training materials. But the technique never became standard doctrine. It was too counterintuitive, too dependent on precise judgment and fuel calculation. Most pilots couldn't overcome their instinct to fly fast and aggressive, and for pilots with functioning engines who could use full power. When needed, John's approach was unnecessary. It was a technique born from necessity, from equipment failure, from having to make a weakness work as strength. In April 1944, John finally received a replacement aircraft, a new P-40 with a perfectly functioning engine that could sustain full power indefinitely. The mechanics expected him to be thrilled. Instead, John seemed ambivalent. "Lieutenant, you can finally fly at full power. No more nursing a sick engine, no more being the slow pilot." "I know," John said, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't sure the new aircraft was actually an improvement. He flew the new P-40 for 3 missions, using full power, flying fast and aggressive like the other pilots. He didn't score any kills during those missions. On the 4th mission, he deliberately pulled his throttle back to 75% power, flew the way he'd been flying for months. He shot down a 0 using his extended combat technique. After that mission, he continued flying at reduced power even though his engine was fully capable. The other pilots were confused. "Smith, why are you still flying slow? Your engine's fixed. You can use full power now." "I can," John said, "but I don't need to. This technique works. Why change what works?" The squadron commander called him in for a discussion. "Lieutenant, you've proven your fuel management technique is effective, but you're limiting your aircraft's performance unnecessarily. You have a fully functional fighter now. Use it." "Sir, with respect, full power doesn't make me more effective. It just makes me faster. My technique, managing fuel, extending combat, waiting for the enemy to exhaust themselves, that's what gets kills. Speed is just one variable. Endurance is another." "That's not how fighter pilots think, Smith." "Maybe it should be, sir." John continued flying at reduced power for the rest of his combat tour. He shot down 3 more enemy aircraft before rotating back to the United States in August 1944 with a total of 11 confirmed kills. His technique remained controversial but undeniably effective. After the war, John returned to Oklahoma, to the reservation where he'd grown up. He'd hoped military service would open opportunities, would earn him the respect that Native Americans rarely received from white society. Instead, he returned to a reservation where poverty was still overwhelming, where opportunities were still limited, where being a combat veteran and an ace meant little to employers who saw his skin color before his service record. He worked various jobs: ranch hand, mechanic, construction worker. He married, raised 3 children, lived a quiet life far from the recognition he might have received if he'd been white. The Air Force sent him a certificate acknowledging his ace status, sent occasional letters about veteran reunions, but he rarely attended. The fighter pilot community was still predominantly white, still uncomfortable with Native American pilots who didn't fit their image of what an ace should be. In 1968, 24 years after the war ended, the Air Force published a comprehensive study on fuel management in extended combat operations. The study included an extensive section on John Smith's December 26, 1943 engagement, analyzing his throttle discipline, his fuel consumption calculations, his use of endurance as a tactical weapon. The study concluded, Lieutenant Smith's technique demonstrates that air combat effectiveness is not solely determined by aircraft performance. Pilot judgment, fuel management, and tactical patience can compensate for performance disadvantages and create strategic opportunities. The study was read by a new generation of fighter pilots preparing for Vietnam, where fuel management would become critical due to the distances involved and the limitations of aerial refueling. F-4 Phantom crews studied John's principles, learned to extend combat when they had fuel advantage, learned to recognize when enemy MiGs were getting low on fuel and becoming vulnerable. In the 1970s, when the Air Force was developing the F-15 Eagle, engineers designing the aircraft's fuel management systems referenced John's wartime experience. They built in sophisticated fuel monitoring that allowed pilots to calculate endurance in real time, to make informed decisions about when to engage aggressively and when to conserve fuel. The principle John had discovered through necessity, that fuel management was as important as speed and maneuverability, became embedded in how modern fighters were designed and operated. John died in 1995 at the age of 76, largely forgotten by the fighter pilot community, but remembered on the reservation as one of the few who'd served with distinction. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, his 11 confirmed kills, his status as one of the few Native American aces. It didn't mention the broken engine that had forced him to develop his technique, or the mockery he'd endured as the slow pilot, or the fact that his fuel management approach had influenced modern fighter tactics. At his funeral, a retired Air Force colonel who'd flown F-15s in Desert Storm spoke, "John Smith fought with broken equipment and turned that disadvantage into innovation. Every modern fighter pilot who monitors fuel state during combat, who makes tactical decisions based on endurance calculations, who understands that sometimes staying power matters more than speed, they're using principles John discovered in 1943. He proved that limitations can inspire innovation, that weakness can become strength if you're smart enough to exploit it." The Air Force Academy added John's story to their curriculum on adaptive tactics and resource management. Cadets studied his December 26th engagement as an example of tactical creativity under constraint. The lesson wasn't just about fuel management. It was about recognizing that standard doctrine might not apply. When your equipment is compromised, that innovation often comes from necessity. That what looks like a disadvantage can be an advantage if you understand how to use it. Modern fighter tactics manuals include sections on fuel state exploitation, using superior fuel reserves to extend engagements, to force enemies into time-limited decisions, to create psychological pressure through sustained combat presence. The terminology is modern, the technology is advanced, but the underlying principle traces back to John Smith's realization that an engine that couldn't run at full power could still win fights by staying in them longer than anyone expected. In 2003, the Kiowa tribe in Oklahoma held a ceremony honoring their war veterans. John's children attended, brought his medals and citations, told stories about their father who'd been mocked as the slow pilot but had shot down 11 enemy aircraft using a broken airplane and superior tactical thinking. A tribal elder spoke about the traditional hunting techniques that John's father had taught him: patience, endurance, letting prey exhaust themselves, and how John had applied those principles to aerial combat. John Smith fought 2 wars, the elder said. He fought the Japanese in the air, and he fought the assumptions people made about Native Americans on the ground. He proved that our traditional knowledge, patience, resource management, understanding that speed isn't always strength, could succeed even in modern technological warfare. He honored our people by winning battles his own way, not by trying to be what others expected. The slow pilot they'd mocked became an ace. The broken engine that should have grounded him became the catalyst for a technique that changed how fighter pilots thought about fuel management. The Native American pilot who didn't fit the fighter jock stereotype proved that traditional indigenous knowledge about patience and resource management could defeat modern aggression and technology. John never wanted recognition for being innovative. He just wanted to fly, to fight, to survive. When his equipment failed him, when his engine couldn't produce full power, when other pilots mocked him as slow and ineffective, he found a way forward. Not by complaining about his limitations, not by demanding better equipment, but by understanding his aircraft so completely that he could turn its weakness into strategic advantage. They mocked the slow pilot, until his throttle control trick shot down 11 zeros, until his fuel management technique proved that endurance could defeat speed, until his broken engine approach influenced how the Air Force designed modern fighters and trained pilots for fuel-limited combat. Every time a fighter pilot checks fuel state before pressing an attack, every time someone extends combat to exploit fuel advantage, every time patience and endurance defeat aggression and speed. That's John Smith's legacy. The Kiowa pilot who flew a broken MiG airplane at reduced power and proved that sometimes the slowest fighter in the sky can be the deadliest. His P-40, the sick bird that couldn't run at full power, was scrapped after the war. The Air Force didn't preserve it because nobody recognized its historical significance. It was just another worn-out fighter, one of thousands discarded when the war ended. But the lesson it taught, that limitations can inspire innovation, that traditional knowledge about patience and resource management remains valid in modern warfare, that being slow doesn't mean being weak. That lesson survived. John Smith never got a parade, never got his face on magazine covers, never got the recognition that white aces received. He returned to poverty on a reservation, worked manual labor jobs, raised his family in obscurity. But he changed how fighter pilots thought about fuel, about endurance, about the relationship between speed and effectiveness. The mechanics had called his aircraft the sick bird. The pilots had called him the slow pilot. The mockery had been constant, the skepticism overwhelming. But John Smith, drawing on traditional Kiowa hunting wisdom, proved that patience and endurance could defeat aggression and speed, that managing resources carefully could create opportunities that raw power couldn't, that a slow fighter with a broken engine could still be deadly if the pilot understood how to use time as a weapon. They mocked the slow pilot, until his throttle discipline saved fuel while enemies burned theirs, until his endurance tactics exhausted aggressive opponents, until his broken engine technique became modern fuel management doctrine, until the Native American ace proved that traditional indigenous wisdom about patience and resource management could revolutionize modern aerial combat.